As you can see here, we are going to be talking about vegetation today. Oh, we got ahead of ourselves. We're going to look at it both down at the form and function, so we'll get down to some individual plants and shapes and morphology. We're also going to look at this bigger, broader category. We'll talk about ground cover, the next layer up, which are shrubs and seedlings, and then mature trees. We'll also add into, when we were talking about these, probably an activity area, because this is a recreation class. And speaking of recreation, one of the conflicts, one of the problems that we have is trampling. And we're going to take a look at some experiments and some data and see what the pattern is with more and less use of an area by recreationists. So this should be a familiar sight, scene where people are avoiding getting their feet wet and they trample wider and wider and wider. We had a soils class earlier and talked about keeping areas draining better than this one is. A soil type that you're probably familiar with, most of you have been down to southern Utah, and so you have seen what's called cryptobiotic soil among its many names. Hidden biota. And this is a case of looking at a different style of trampling. This is where a motor vehicle has driven down a hillside or up it with cryptobiotic soil crushing that soil. A friend who was being the acting district ranger or acting supervisor, since this was Park Service, for arches, bridges, and one other. Now I've forgotten which. Canyonlands, there we go. Had an experiment where there was a hillside like this in an area that was disturbed, and they took a look. They ran a truck down it, they ran a bicycle down it, and they ran a hiker down it. And then they watched it for many, many years. And so, because what they were doing was, which ones of these are going to recover more quickly, which one is the more permanent damage. So if you can think about it, would it be a four-wheel drive, wide tires, would it be a skinny tire of a bicycle, or would it be a hiker? And in the long run, it turned out that the recovery from the hiker was the fastest. The microbiotic soil moved in from the sides for each one of those steps. And the wider, broader tire tracks also filled in eventually with cryptobiotic soil coming from the sides. But the deeper, narrower bicycle track actually never recovered. It kept funneling rainwater. So trampling is not all equal. Some areas bicycles are eliminated. And this is a wilderness area, this sign. So it's for a different reason. It's not ecological reasons. It's because it's not a primitive form of recreation. So looking at some experiments here, we read the table title down there, Figure 3.3, median values of relative vegetation loss, plotted in relation to the amount of use in this wilderness area, two wilderness areas. So across the bottom, across the x-axis, is the amount of use, which they said is in the number of days per season, and then versus the relative vegetation loss. And you can see what they called light, which is 2 or 3 days per season, were approaching 75% vegetation loss in the very light conditions. And then it leveled off, and up to 15 days per season. It stayed mostly steady for 2 of them, rose in the one, and then after that, which is the only one they had more data on, it continued. So why does it level off? Probably because of the plant species. So all of the ground cover that you step on that is vulnerable was probably killed off within just a couple of nights. Leaving your tent on top of wildflowers will kill it in 2 nights. So, and then the plants that are left are the shrubs and the trees, and so it takes longer for those to die due to recreational use. same kind of idea here. We're now reading figure 3-4, relative vegetation cover near the center of campsites in 2 environments. One is forest, one is meadow. After 1, 2, and 3 years of camping intensities, and 1 and 4 nights per year. So that's still pretty low use. Okay, so in the meadow environment, which is the left set of graphs, the drop-off is after 1 night. Doesn't change that much after 4 nights per year. In the forest, though, we're not seeing recovery. So over there in the forest, there after 1 night, there is less vegetation cover, and 4 nights made a really big difference. The first night, there's probably just a lot less vegetation cover in the first place, deep in a forest under the trees. So by 4 nights, we're seeing that whatever plants there are under the forest canopy, they are more vulnerable than out in the meadow. So the meadow is a better growing environment for the low ground plants that get trampled. So how do we apply this? Leave no trace guidelines would say if you don't have a trail area, you're looking for either spreading out. This way only one person ever steps on the same plant. So we've got 6 people here that are traveling, each one going their own route. You can see that people have walked through there. You can see the bent over plants, but especially the grasses are going to recover quickly. And we'll take a look at why that is the case. So when you are doing field studies out here, there are a number of things that get looked at. Percent of the area that you're studying, what percent of it is covered with vegetation. Typically, people will use 1 meter square, and they'll have a metal or a plastic 1 meter square that you can take apart and then put it back together. So it's easy to carry. It's 4 sides in a straight line strapped together, and then you assemble them at the corners. And it's just very quick what percentage is covered in vegetation, or how, the opposite is how much soil is showing alongside. Much more invasive is to do the biomass per quadrat. So this means digging up the vegetation. So you're going to be taking out the root, the whole plant, and then shaking off all the soil, and then oven drying it and getting it down to dried biomass. So pretty invasive. Rarely is that done. Species composition matters. So we're going to see why different forms of plants, different morphology, survive better than others. And I can tell you right now that wildflowers generally don't do well with trampling. Grasses do. So your vegetation species composition can change over time too. Okay, trees we usually don't crush. We generally mechanically damage those either with fire or breaking off lower branches, carving our initials in them. So those kinds of field studies look different than the ones looking at ground cover. And then all of these, you're usually looking for an area that is used by recreation, and then you compare it to other areas that you're pretty sure don't have a lot of use. That's a standard technique. I know when they're looking at like where sheep and cattle are driven through an area, you'll compare to the actively grazed areas to the nearest places that are not actively grazed. There are some experiments that are run in vegetation and recreation. We will get some data from some of those, and it's like the number of times that somebody walks and steps on a plant. Exclosures are things that the BLM and Forest Service both use, and they're used typically in grazing allotments, and they'll fence off an area maybe 100 feet to a side and put in a substantial fence that will keep out whatever species you're trying to keep out. And then if it's cattle grazing, sheep grazing, they can't get into that exclosure. And so you have a control area inside that exclosure. So you will bump into those every once in a while when you're out hiking or backpacking. Here's a vegetation loss study, or a potential vegetation loss, trying to use photography This mountain is Mount Nebo, the southernmost and highest peak in the Wasatch Range. And the idea is to establish a camera location that can be recovered every year or every 5 years and take really high quality, these are 4x5 negatives from that camera, so really high quality images. And then you go back and compare 1 year to the next, just the green areas that you see here versus the brown areas that are down to just soil and rock. So that's just a longevity study using ground photography. Here are just two plant biologists out doing, instead of a quadrat, a linear measurement. So they have an anchor point that's recoverable. You can come back every year or every 5 years and stretch a horizontal tape out. That one looks like it might be 30 feet, 10 meters. And then going through and identifying, at least down to the genus, every plant. And you'd still be doing things like percent of vegetation cover versus soil. And usually in a spot like this that you can see is steep and therefore really vulnerable to erosion, they probably aren't going to be digging up the plants and getting biomass. That's not as important for this study, which is just a concern of vegetation loss due to browsing, grazing. This is an endangered species. This is Macaranthara King Eye, which is in the aster or daisy family. It's only found in a few locations and always up on cliffs, and we don't know if that's because it just got grazed off down low or if it really just doesn't compete well down there. So again, we're trying to establish some sites and driving a nail into a crack that we hope we can find years later. We describe where it is, and then use that circular protractor and give degrees from vertical and the number of inches and the number of plants in a radius coming out from there. So another interesting vegetation study. Also, this is used in climbing areas where they're concerned about endangered plants and climbers, rock climbers digging them out. Different vegetation study. This is north of Nome a ways, and the idea here is we're in an international park, Beringia International Park, and there's talk of the Native Americans who live there herding reindeer for meat. And the question is, how will we know how much damage is being done by artificial herds of reindeer, caribou? And so we need to get a base idea of what the plant composition is and the amount of cover, so before the reindeer are brought out on the tundra. This was a place where we did collect vegetation, including its roots, and take it back to a lab, get all the dirt off that we could, and then dried it in special ovens and weighed that. So that could then be compared to future studies, along with species composition and ground cover, which was pretty much 100% in that area. Okay, we're going to switch a little bit here and take a look at morphology. And so we're not really looking at species, which are a lot harder to identify, but instead just the general morphology, or the shape, the form of the plants, and how we are particularly interested in ability to withstand disturbance here. Just tying it to your book, this is page 48, where on page 48 we look at a bunch of different morphological differences. So procumbent means it's the growth travels along the ground, and decumbent means it pokes up. So procumbent you think of as ivies, they travel long ways. Down low, fairly soft. You have to have a woody structure for a plant to grow up, so it needs to be holding itself up. Some of these can be quite strong, some are flexible, others are brittle, And the more they poke up, the more likely they are going to be disturbed, with flexible ones being able to recover more easily. But if it's just laying down on the ground, grasses, ivy, strawberries, those do pretty well with disturbance. Tufted growth probably does well with disturbance. This is where particularly grasses and sedges grow in clumps around a root cluster, and probably there's just room to step around them is what's happening. Thorns, that's just a protective thing, so yeah, people stay away from thorny plants. And then if they are woody and poke up, flexible ones like willows that can, a moose can step on them, you can step on them, they're going to bounce back without being brittle and breaking. Basal rosette is going to be like the tufted, that the plant is focused in one area above the roots, and then you're more likely to step around it, including animals. The one on the right, the agave, has an advantage of when it rains, it does help draw rainwater into the center, where it then drips down into the soil close to the plant and into the roots. So that's a special case of a basal rosette with broad, erect leaves. And then these are very flexible leaves that in the wind can just wave and bend, and they aren't brittle and snap off like we had so much of in the windstorm in Salt Lake a couple weeks ago. Being very small, where you're avoided, not attractive, or very large, where you're so big everything goes around you, can be very helpful. Also, having very thick bark can be helpful. Keep insects out, keep birds from pecking as many holes in you. And any mechanical disturbance is just out on the surface. A lot of the really thick bark trees are frequently fire resistant as well, so they don't overheat the way a thin bark tree would. So there's a thicker barked, probably a spruce, could be a fir, versus a very thin barked in that same area, an aspen. And the thin barked, unfortunately, here people like to carve because of the contrasting color. But these open the plants up. That's a TV set, I assume. That makes them more vulnerable to insects, to fungus getting inside. So these trees, they die. So don't go carving your name. They don't all die, which is why people continue to do it, but it does make them more vulnerable. And that, I just love that picture. There is no reason for that picture to be in here other than that's a very interesting face. Okay, this is also from your book. So we are looking at, in this case, we're looking at plant forms and their morphology, and we are particularly interested in the location of the vegetative buds, or persistent stem apex. Okay, that survives over the winter. So looking at this first one, let's get, So here is a plant that pokes up. Its growth is out here at the apex of each of these stems, and that actually leaves it somewhat vulnerable to browsing, especially. So deer might bite off, moose will bite off the growth. So usually you need to have a whole bunch of these to survive, which is why willows and stuff grow in thickets. These are a little bit better protected. So the bud growth here, this is one that's tipping over, a little more recumbent. So they still get grazed. Now more by sheep than browsed by deer. Putting your buds down in the grounds close to the root can be a place where they're a little bit harder to find. And then putting like bulbs all the way underground, they're pretty well protected from above at least. And these are aquatic versions of them. So when you can get your buds down low, and then you can see they root out. So a strawberry plant does this. It's a combination of 2 and 3 for a strawberry plant if you're familiar with them. Okay, so tolerance. So we're going to have these two terms, resistance and another one in a moment. Resistance is a function of structure, so resisting disturbance. And sometimes being really high is helpful, sometimes being low is helpful. Okay, tolerance is really about recovery instead of resistance, so the ability to recover rather than to resist. Means you put up with the disturbance, but you recover. And here's where grasses come to such a great advantage, because even if you kill everything above ground, they have an incredible root system. So grasses do tolerate, which is why you have them in your yard, tolerate a lot of disturbance. They're flexible, so they're also pretty resistant. Okay, recovery or resistance, but seldom both. So, but you'll see some in a moment that do a little bit of both. Generally, your structures either allow you to recover like grasses or resist like trees. Okay, so staying small and creeping, we've already mentioned. Being flexible, so being stepped on, they recover rather than brittle where they're snapped off. Okay, we looked at pictures of location of vegetative buds and ability to reproduce vegetatively we have not talked about. So vegetation buds on an aspen are way up in the tree. In the spring they put out catkins. They're in the same family as willows, so their catkins look a lot like pussy willows. But the main way that aspen reproduce is vegetatively, and same with grasses. So the roots are able to grow out near the surface and start a whole new stem growing up at any point along the roots. So aspen, if you planted them in the city where they don't do particularly well because they need a cooler environment, but if you water them enough, they'll grow, and pretty soon they'll try taking over your lawn because they'll just sprout up. They'll spread their roots wide and then sprout up little new stems all over the place. So aspen really reproduce vegetatively far more than they do through their flowering system and seeds. Tight flexible cells, those are the ones that are flexible. Those are going to be in your grasses. The more hollow and brittle ones, that are going to be holding up your flowers, your wildflowers. Those don't do well with trampling. So yes, gramanoids, the grasses, the sedges, when and why. And we've already answered that question, but you can review back and think of why grasses do so well. There you can see the root system of these grasses. Okay, resistance versus resilience. So we have across the X across the bottom a resilience index, meaning recovery, and a resistance index going up the vertical. So over here on resilience, 0 is in the middle, and then we have negative values relative to the others, and then the ability to resist. So let's swing to the left of resilience, so very poor resilience, but perhaps really good resistance, moving up there as up to 75%. So their chance is not through resilience, meaning recovery, but instead resisting. So we're probably talking about trees. You cut down a tree, it doesn't grow back, but it can resist an awful lot once it's a large stem tree. And then the two other ones that are interesting are the two dark ones, just going to the other extreme, where they are both resisting and resilient. And if we go down here, we've got Erect Gramanoids. Nope, those are white. They're clear, so they're down lower. They're not doing as well. The other dark one is non-erect Gramanoids. So these are your grasses that can fold over. And I see that the other solid one, the solid triangles, are the non-erect forbs. So these are going to be things like, not like your regular wildflowers, but probably more like the strawberries that grow along the ground pretty easily. Okay, we're going to make another leap and look very broadly at vegetation types. We had a lesson on soils, so that's looking at major soil types, and you're going to see that it matches pretty closely here. with vegetation types. And the main thing that we're talking about here, looking at the maps on the right, is we have similar soils here inside the tropics where we have so much extra moisture. And then we have, moving away from the tropics, these desert areas. But depending on the wind direction, so the wind is coming from the east down here and here. So these are the hurricane paths. Then we get soils that develop in wet areas. And then more moderate plant taiga trees, and then ice up here. And then mountainous areas are just given a different, they're more complex across short distances because of the elevation changes that are possible. Okay, so that's just big, broad, tropical rainforest, desert, very mesic or even hydric, very wet due to prevailing winds coming off the ocean, and then a moderate in-between area of tall forests, and then you eventually get to where tall trees just don't grow. It's too far north, and in here it can be too high up. So let's take a look at a cross-section of a mountain range, because kind of the same thing is going on. That down low, this is a mountain range. If we look down here, we're in the Andes in Colombia. This is looking at the vegetation type 14 to 20,000 years ago, so right at the end of the last ice age period, active ice ages here, to beginning to thaw out. So what we're going to see is a very up at the top, below 5,000 meters down to 35,000 meters, 3,500 meters, excuse me, that we have perennial snow. And when we look at the present, it's only up here at the top. So it's got to be pretty high. Then we just have the Alpine Tundra vegetation here in wavy. It's much thinner and higher here. Then we are getting the montane, the mountain, again thinner and higher. And then this is a lower forest area. And then by the bottom we're starting to get to, depending on where you are relative to the weather, either really dry or a tropical woodland if you're in the area that gets so much rain, so tropical. Okay, so similar to going north-south or south or central to north, central to south, sorry, equator to the south is very similar to going up in elevation. And the reason being is temperature and the growing season. So the growing season, a short, cold growing season, is going to have very different plants from a year-round growing season with either in a dry area or a tropical rain area. So it's pretty similar to going north or south from the equator. And here we are. This is the Chugach Range between Anchorage and Prince William Sound. And just taking a look at some of the elevation here. So this is the permanent snow in this area. It's farther north. And then we have just ground surface vegetation of the tundra. And then we're starting to get a few very small trees. The growing season's too short. They have not gotten to be very tall and probably won't. Probably the snow level has protected them in the winter. As they get taller, they poke up above the snow and don't do as well. Okay, but we do have flexible. These willows are going to get crushed in the snow and be protected from the wind down there. Looking at a very different environment. So this for these pack rat middens, and I'll describe them in a moment, you need a somewhat dry environment. If it's raining all the time, these things just dissolve. So Neotoma, the pack rat itself, is a cute little rat. Not as big as a squirrel, but bigger than a mouse, bigger than a chipmunk. And they're called pack rats because they haul stuff into their nesting area and they sort of build defenses with them so that bigger creatures can't chase in there and eat them. So they're trying to keep the coyotes out. And they'll drag anything in there, and then they urinate on them, which then crystallizes when it dries and sort of holds everything together in what looks like an amber, a very black one. And now that you know about these guys, you'll start seeing these black areas up in the cliffs down in southern Utah, especially where some rockfall has fallen out, and you'll see the black areas up where the rocks fell from that used to be in the cracks. Okay, so then we can take those pack rat middens and dissolve them and look at what plant species they've dragged in over time. And we have to use radiocarbon dating. And the yellow circles here are the known pack rat midden collections that have been identified. And then what we're seeing here is Engelman Spruce right there on the Utah-Nevada border. There are some going back to 21,000 years ago. And so that's Engelman Spruce. We do have it here in the Wasatch too. We just haven't identified it through pack rat middens. And then, let's see, this would be subalpine fir. And there were some circles for that. Because this was a timed, I got behind in the slideshow. But they are still extant. Extant is a good word. It means it still exists there. So it's the opposite of extinct. It's extant. And we do find just a couple of places in Nevada, Oregon desert, where we have subalpine fir still growing. So, but looking in the pack rat midden, we have found a few indications of that they've come and gone over the last, and this is an interesting number because this is at the end of the last glacial period. So it's over this time it's been warming up. Okay, so specifically how the pack rat middens usually work. Sometimes you do find macrofossils that you can identify. So these are usually going to be leaves and seeds, but more often than not, blowing in to the pack rat middens are pollens. So these are samples of pollens over time. So this is a volume and this is over time. So here the present is over here off the map, off to the right, off the graph. And then 10,000 years ago, oops, go back, 20,000, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, and looking at these different species, and we are finding that Engelman spruce was not there long ago. Limber pine has been in that area throughout. Sagebrush has been in that general area throughout. Currants is a shrub, and keep doing that. The record isn't very complete there. It looks like shad scale came and went, and same with fern bush, which is a plant I don't know. So anyway, that's using pack rat middens to look at vegetation distribution over long periods of time. Okay, another way that we date things, and we will have a class on this at the end of the semester, is Dendrochronology, where you core in that drill that she's holding. Let's go back. That drill that she's holding is hollow, and so you core into the tree, trying to hit the center of the tree to hit the earliest, oldest ring, and then you pull back out, and a solid tube about the diameter of a pencil comes out inside that drill. It's a hand drill, and it's carried in that blue case. And so then we date those. You've probably seen Dendrochronology on tree cross sections where you can look at the rings, but this is just we still get to look at the rings. We just don't have to kill the tree to do it. Okay, so and what they're studying here, that tree she's coring into is a pinyon pine, and across all the studies, they've been able to date how old the trees go back, how far back the trees go. So these are the gray stippled areas where we find them. So you can see they make it a little bit north of Utah into Idaho. Much of Nevada has the single leaf pinyon pine. But until 6,000 years ago, it was only found south of that line. And then 8,000 years ago, it was only south of that line. And 10,000 years ago, we're only finding evidence of it south of that line. So different ways to look at vegetation migration. This is the true pollen one. So pack rat middens, again, we're not going to spend as much time here. I just want you to see that here we are dating from the present back 2,000 to 10,000 years ago, looking at pollen. And take a look at these species. These are the ones that were in this area the longest ago. Serviceberry, quaking aspen, rose, and narrow-leafed willows. And you can see they're gone in this low elevation site by 8,000 years ago. They grow now in much higher elevations. So we have more evidence from pollen that these trees did grow down low once, and now we only find them up high. And they've been replaced by these much lower elevation, mostly shrubs now. Anyway, there's how we gather evidence on plant migration. Same kind of idea here. We're looking at radiocarbon dating age going backwards, so the 0 is here to the right, 5,000 to 20,000 years ago, so it's the melting of the glaciers here. And then elevation in meters. So farthest back, we've got the triangles. This is the subalpine vegetation. So some of your conifers, just the very top ones, which in the Wasatch we're only talking about Engelman spruce and subalpine fir. So we've got some of that in there. You can see it's much more abundant as we get close to our time, but eventually it fades out and disappears. So we're just looking at the subalpine vegetation. And we finally, as we get close to the present, very little of it still growing up here at 2,700 meters. So anyway, you can do that with all of the others. And then down here, you can see that we don't get the desert vegetation until just 4,000 years ago for whatever site this is, which is somewhere out in the middle of Nevada. Anyway, so again, we're looking at species migration, climate change over time. And here we are back to this concept that not only are plants limited where they can grow over time and the environment changes currently with elevation. So this is someplace theoretically must be in Arizona because it's got saguaro and mesquite, which we don't have in Utah. This requires no freezes whatsoever year-round. A saguaro cannot tolerate freezes. And then we do have the rest of these species in Utah. So we do have a desert vegetation that's not represented here. Ours is different. And then we go to PJ forest, pinyon juniper forests. We have gamble oak going not quite as far north as Logan, but almost. Ponderosa is an interesting tree in Utah. It's all across the southern part of the state, and it goes up the Green River and is in the Uindas. The Uindas have a lot of ponderosa pine, and the Wasatch has no ponderosa pine other than ones that have been planted. So for whatever reason, as the trees migrated north, the path of the ponderosa did not make it to the Wasatch or through most of Nevada. But you will find very large, thick stands of both ponderosa and Doug fir in the Pacific Northwest. So the Great Basin just kind of got missed by ponderosa. moving up through the low elevation conifers, we get to aspen, and then your high elevation conifers, which tend to be subalpine fir and Engelman spruce around here. And then as the growing season gets shorter and the wind more severe and the cold more severe, yeah, we get some trees growing for a while that are physically harmed, shaped by the environment. These seedlings, had they been started down here, would have grown tall, but instead that's the weather that's changing their shape. And eventually we get above tree line. So the growing season is just too short to support large woody trees. So those of you that took the weather class from me in 3050, what differences might exist on the west side of the Rockies or the Sierras versus the east side, and why? So do you remember our different uplift mechanisms of orographic, convective, cyclonic, and frontal? And can you explain that? We'll look at this side. So here is a rough elevation on the bottom in meters, up to 3,000 meters, and the Sierras poking up to 14,000 feet. Most of the Great Basin is mountainous, but low elevation, and then we get the Wasatch and the Uindas, and then the Rockies in Colorado poking up. And we can see that with that elevation matches precipitation. So this is the orographic uplift, and then that's air that is being forced up by the mountains, so it expands, it cools, it condenses, we get precipitation. And then on the downside, just the opposite. The air is being compressed, becomes more dense and warmer, and it can hold the moisture. And then it hits here into the Wasatch and the Uindas, and we get more precipitation again, and same as you get into the Rocky Mountains. So the clouds move across, they dissipate in the Great Basin Desert, and then we get snow again, rain again up high in the mountains. Okay, we did talk about tree line. We have multiple tree lines, so it's mildly confusing. And what we have here in the Great Basin, which is the top picture, is we have an upper elevation tree line and we have a lower elevation tree line. The upper elevation tree line is going to be very weather growth period dependent. Here in the Great Basin, short winters, long winters, short growing seasons, and lack of moisture. So you'll see that the trees where the two arrows are much higher than in between the arrows. In between the arrows is south facing, so those slopes are going to evaporate, not enough moisture to grow trees, which is the reason for the limiting tree line down at the bottom. So down in our bottom valleys in the Great Basin in Utah, Nevada especially, we have lower elevation tree lines due to lack of water to support big tall trees. Your upper elevation tree lines usually about cold growing and short growing seasons. So the bottom picture is in Denali National Park, and where the tree line is at only a few hundred feet, maybe 1,000 feet, rather than tree line around here, which is around 11,000 feet. So short growing seasons, the farther north you get at the same elevation. All right, we're going to stick to the mountains, but take a leap. Any of you that grew up in Utah are familiar with this large lake to the right on the edge of Utah called Lake Bonneville, which filled the Salt Lake Valley, and you can see it went into Nevada, up into Idaho, and most of the way down the west side of Utah. So a large lake being filled by melting glaciers at the end of the last ice age. And we're going to look at the geology here. This would be a cross-section looking west or east of the Uinda Mountains. So the Uinda Mountains are interesting and how they affect vegetation growth. All mountains are. These are folded mountains. The Wasatch Range is fault blocked, so blocks of rock have broken and tipped up on one side. The Uindas are folded, so it's probably happened more slowly over time, with not as many breaks. And then the outside layer of carpet here is discontinuous. It doesn't reach across to the other side because of erosion. So we can see that in the Uindas in aerial photographs. So here is the spine of the Uindas. So that cross-sectional fold could have been, let's say, right here. And then you can see out here on the edges that some of the folded rock has eroded away. You can see it down on the bottom too. It's not as clear on this side, but these are fascinating flat irons poking up on the edges of the Uindas, and then the high ground is up in here. Okay, you'll also see that the high ground in the Uindas doesn't support vegetation, so we do have an upper tree line here, and then we have a lower tree line on both sides as we get into more desert-like environments. Okay, and then this is, oh, this must be Rock Creek, and this thing has almost all burned, this entire basin. Now this is the Duchesne, this is Rock Creek, and this is pretty much all burned all the way over here into Lake Fork, and hasn't made it to Yellowstone yet. Okay, sorry, that's just about this summer. It's burning right now. Okay, so looking at the present day, and then taking a leap back here, this is what geologists have mapped out. So this pale green area and some of these yellow areas are where the glaciers, the full extent of the glaciers, some of this is outwash from the glaciers, so a little bit confusing of a map. So what we have here are this long axis of the Uindas dropping to both sides, and honestly this picture should bother you a little bit looking at the amount of glaciation, because look at the spacing out here. So much less ice compared to not a lot of space in between. So these glaciers are much more packed together into an ice cap. So when you think about, if you know the Uindas, and probably many of you do, where are the high peaks? And so that's King's Peak right there, pretty center in this image. Second highest peak in the Uindas is Gilbert Peak, Tokiwana, if I remember. It's anyway, we've got a couple of other high peaks. There are a bunch of them that are above 13,000 feet in this area. But where is the heaviest glaciation? Where is it the both thickest and broadest? And that is not at the high peaks, but instead over here to the west. So that's puzzled geologists for a long time, and some of the idea is that the weather is coming in from the west, and so we have an orographic uplift here which will intensify precipitation, and then precipitation will thin off because it was stolen from here. But the numbers didn't quite add up. That did make sense, and timing has been looked at more, and this is why I brought back earlier this idea, the reminder that Lake Bonneville used to sit out here, because now geologists are realizing that there was a lake effect, that there was enhanced moisture on the from Lake Bonneville. So as the ice melted out, filled up this basin, it was then raining harder and snowing harder in the winter, and then we've now enhanced the orographic effect by having lake effect, and the amount of snowfall just still drops off as you go east. So that's why the ice back then was different, and why the vegetation now is a little bit different on the west side of the Uindas, drier, higher elevations on the east. Okay, another leap. Let's take a look at trees. We've already hinted about this. I showed you a core that would just drill in and take out just a thin stripe, and then we could count the rings from there too. We will have a day on Dendrochronology toward the end of class, so we'll find out it's a little more complicated than that. Okay, but the reason we have these rings is the paler areas here are hollower cells, and then these are called tracheids, and they connect together, and that's where the water flows up from the roots and out the leaves. So this is a negative pressure system where evaporation from the leaves draws up the water behind it, another molecule of water. So as one evaporates out, another one gets sucked in through the root hairs. And then to distribute the carbohydrates back down, because all of it needs to have some nutrients, there's a system in the cambial layer on the outside that distributes. And we're going to see in a minute why that matters to recreation. So this is a close-up now. Those were those dark stripes, and then you can actually look straight down into some of the cells. So this is at the end of the year, as the growth slows down, the cell walls get thicker and look darker to us. Then the next year we have new young growth again, and then we have the end of the year growth that's darker, smaller cells. Okay, and it's through these that, through this evapotranspiration, that water is drawn due to evaporation at the leaf, and then that suction draws water up from the soil. That's important. Okay, and then here we are looking at happening in a forb, so a soft plant, and just the same idea that water is next to the roots, and then as evaporation happens up here at the stomata in the leaves, that's one continuous water layer, and it pulls water with dissolved nutrients. And remember, it's mainly because of the mycorrhizae that we have dissolved nutrients in there. And then that's drawn slowly, one molecule at a time, out the leaves. Okay, so, and then to redistribute nutrients around to the structures around the outside is an osmotically driven system that redistributes right under the bark. You can see this brown layer under the bark. So if you damage the bark and the layer underneath it, that's going to kill the trees, and this is a problem with recreation. So here's where probably some kid was handed a hatchet and just went smacking at the tree. Not enough to actually gather firewood. And then same thing here. These are just damage from campers, and if it goes all the way around the tree, there's a nail poking out. There's a nail. Somebody had tied their trash up right here. Anyway, so these are mechanical damages to the tree, and that cambial layer is really, really critical for the tree to survive. So if you girdle a tree, cut it all the way around. Even if you don't cut it down, that will kill the tree. That's just looking at details. We can skip that for this class. I do want you to go out. We aren't going to do this as part of this video, but do go out, even if it's just your yard, and take a look at some vegetation out there. And you know, the strata is it ground? Is it shrubs and bushes, or seedlings, or is it tall vegetation? And then the morphology, is it creeping along the ground? Is it tall and resistant? Is it flexible? And then see where you think it fits in the different tolerance ideas that we looked at earlier on that were listed on page 48. Okay, let's take this even more to recreation. And these are going to be our categories. We've got on the trail here, we have the activity zone. And for now, we'll call that 1. And then we have the ground cover. That's more obvious here just on the edges of the trails, probably because the trees were cleared all the way out to make this trail. And then we have the shrubs and seedlings. So some of these will stop as shrubs, and others are seedlings that will eventually replace the trees. And then we have the mature trees. So those are our 4 zones when we're talking about within a small site. And so when you are doing your small site assessment, these are great terms to use. You can talk about the activity area, ground cover, shrubs and seedlings, and then mature trees, if you have all of those. So hang on to those terms. Use them in your final report. Looking at a picnic area, we have the activity area again, the ground cover, the shrubs, and seedlings and mature trees. So let's look at it in a number of different environments. So ground cover down here, sorry this is not a great picture. Really we are only showing 2 of the zones here, ground cover and mature trees. And here we have just activity area. Way out here on the outer edges we've got some trees and shrubs. This is a beach area, so this is probably all they ever have is ground cover and then bare ground. Kind of shrubs down here. Mostly these are more ivy-like. You can see them creeping along. And that's how they survive in wind-blown sand. Activity zone. Yeah, this is a trail in a bad place. The water just runs down it rather than spreads broadly. So activity zone, some ground cover, and then in trees, shrubs, pretty thick on the edges. The activity area here you can see is eroded down several feet with that trail. This trail's doing a little better, less use. Not much ground cover. It goes pretty much into that shrubs and seedlings in this area. And this is ground cover going almost straight into trees. There are a couple of little shrubby things here. Desert environment, so we have the water, a shrub area, not a lot of grasses in this area, a few back in here. And then shrubs, and only in the river area, the riparian, do we actually get trees. These are probably cottonwoods, maybe box elder. Few pinyon and juniper up here on this hillside. So, mitigating soil, which we started with earlier in the week, and vegetation impacts. We are going to go into mitigations, things that we can do in future classes, but yeah, that's coming up. So we've had a good look now at soil and vegetation, how easily disturbed they are, and we've, especially with soils and trails, we did talk about some mitigation. We'll talk about more as we go further into the semester.